Hello, YouTube, and welcome to something completely different. A thought experiment I did with myself and wanted to share with you, the audience. This is going to be an alternate history sort of thing, specifically gaming history. This started as me thinking about what I would do if I could make a game console, but it evolved into a fictional history of an entire game company. So, first things first, this is a work of historical fiction. Any resemblance to any real person is entirely coincidental. These events are not real in our world, but you can think of them as having happened in an alternate timeline. Certain real-world companies and games will be referenced, such as Nintendo, Sega, and a few others. If I end up making you feel nostalgic for a game console that doesn't exist, I've done my job. If I do not, well, that's fine too. Now, let us begin. The year is 1982, and things are going pretty well for everyone. At least until 83, when there is a bit of a crash in the game industry. During this time, two men meet each other to develop an arcade game from Atari called Pizza Master. Those two men were Rochester Manning and Lawrence LaFleur, who immediately became good friends and stuck together afterwards. The money they got from Pizza Master would come in handy later when they caught wind that Nintendo was making its own home console, and since Atari wasn't living up to their contract, they left and founded their own company, Sharkware. Manning and LaFleur took the money from Pizza Master and their retirement funds, as well as a bake sale of all things, in order to buy top-end electronics to create their own home console, wanting to make it better than the upcoming NES in every way. Of course, they would need the NES itself to release before they knew the specs, but after the NES had been out for 1 month, they had designed their own console, and 1 year later, they released the Alpha Shark, a very expensive piece of hardware mostly aimed at upper-class and upper-middle-class children. In addition to being extremely high-end at the time, the Alpha Shark had 6 launch titles. Each Alpha Shark was sold with not 1, but 2 of these launch titles to try and justify the price of the system, which was well over $650 USD in today's money. Upon receiving an Alpha Shark, you would also get Sharkman and 1 other random launch title. The other launch titles were a licensed Monsters game, of all things, Starship Limburger, Flight of Ducks, Arachnid Panic, and Fartio Bros. Sharkman, however, was special, since it was one of the very earliest action RPGs to exist, complete with a level system, 2-player mode, and an unexpectedly humorous plot where you play as Victor Brandon Carchero, the titular Sharkman, in a top-down game with a large overworld similar to The Legend of Zelda. If you press start on a second controller, another character would appear next to you, a crocodile man named Francis Rodney Suchus, or Sucus, controlled by player 2. Francis would spawn in at the same level as his friend, and would also gain levels at the same time as him, a mechanic that was praised for its convenience at the time, but in more recent years has been subject to scrutiny. Aside from Sharkman itself and the licensed Monsters game, all of the launch titles had references to Sharkman in them, usually in the form of Sharkman posters or in-game characters mentioning the game. But Starship Limburger, a Gradius-style space shooter, took this a step further with its most powerful weapon, the Limburger launcher, which seemingly launched wedges of stinky cheese at foes. The way of getting this weapon was also incredibly frustrating, since you could only buy it on the in-game store for 1,000,000 points, which is incredibly tedious to grind out. The fact it was with Limburger cheese was probably already a reference to Sharkman anyway, since Mr. Sucus's most powerful weapon was a wheel of stinky cheese. But they took it a step further. When you purchase the weapon, a dialogue box outright tells you that the weapon was developed by a descendant of Francis Sucus. Which also kind of implies that these games take place in the same universe. The Alpha Shark sold fairly well, outperforming the Sega Master System, though not nearly beating out the NES, and had many great titles on it that took advantage of its higher processing power with highly detailed backgrounds and many enemies or other entities on the screen at once. However, like any console system, it had some truly abysmal games as well. The most famous example is the baffling case of Madden 85. Madden 85 was exactly what it sounds like. A game about American football with 8-bit graphics, music, and all the stuff you'd expect. Except it was a port. There was also an NES version of the game, and the Madden company wanted it on both consoles. Everyone expected the Alpha Shark version to be superior, but instead it was the exact same game as the NES version, except much worse. Somehow, the Sharkware developers managed to completely invert the directional controls, so you'd have to press right to go left, up to go down, and vice versa. And that wasn't even all either. The start button was supposed to pause the game and bring up a small menu, and while it did bring up a menu and make your character unable to move, the game kept running without you. And most baffling of all, the passing system was completely overpowered. If you or your AI opponent passed the ball, there was literally no way to stop the recipient from catching it. You couldn't intercept it, and even if you tackled them before they got it, they'd still catch it and get right back up as if nothing happened. It's no surprise that the Madden Incident, as it's called, was a huge subject of debate and conspiracy theories, as you do. But these were put to bed when LaFleur held a press conference claiming that this all happened because Madden 85 was written in a programming language that the Shark just couldn't comprehend, and that's why the controls didn't work. This got people off their backs until the year 2000, when hackers and programmers were making an Alpha Shark emulator and agreed to make a fixed version of the football game, only to look at the code and see that the programming language was the same used for every other Alpha Shark game, exposing a nearly 15-year-old lie and starting a plethora of conspiracy theories. They did still fix the game up, though, so now Madden 85 has a definitive version on emulator. However, the exact reason for why this happened is still unknown to this day. Of course, all good things come to an end, but the late life of the Alpha Shark gave us two important games to send it off: Madeline Manta and Sharkman 2. Madeline Manta was a puzzle platformer starring a Manta girl who we learn via the manual is on a mission to rescue Mr. Carchero and Mr. Sukas, who have been captured and imprisoned by an unnamed evil oil tycoon. Yes, really. Once you beat the game, it's revealed that Ms. Manta is actually dating Victor Carchero, and their relationship is actually pretty sweet. This game was actually pretty decent by itself, but it takes place right before Sharkman 2, as evidenced by the fact that in that game, the two sea creatures are married. Sharkman 2 is a top-down action RPG like its predecessor, but it pushes the hardware to its limits, with primitive AI controlling Mr. Sukas whenever you don't have a player 2, as well as a separate XP system for him. You can also recruit Madeline as a party member who knows a bit of magic established in her game, though she mostly uses it to make enemies weaker and does little damage on her own. The main problem with the game is Mr. Sukas, along with another recruitable party member, Jillian E. Squalia, a gecko girl, also a magic user but far more offense-oriented. The two of them have a tendency to steal everything constantly, and when they're not stealing your kills and your EXP, they're getting their butts killed. Of course, this is far less of a problem if you have actual friends to play with, but if you don't, you can expect a little frustration. The Alpha Shark was a good system, but you're far better off emulating it than trying to find one online, because even used systems go for over $1,000 on eBay and similar sites, and a sealed, unopened Alpha Shark can run you over 10,000 USD. If nothing else, it's certainly less strain on your wallet. Plus, the hackers and programmers responsible for Alpha Shark emulation often include bug fixes and quality of life improvements, making the emulated games the definitive versions. At least until later, but we'll get to that. In 1991, 1 year after the Japanese release of the Super Nintendo, Sharkware released the Beta Shark, which was made to be better than the Super Nintendo, but was predictably more expensive as well, taking the same old audience by storm. It was, however, slightly more cheaply made, so as to improve their profits, mainly by using hard plastic instead of die-cast metal for the outer casing, and cheaper power lights. Predictably, the launch title was Sharkman 3, another top-down action RPG, but this time with a smarter AI. You could also choose your main character. Up to 4 players could play at once, each choosing their character until all 4 of the characters from last game are picked. And the characters also poke fun at Sucus and Squalia for being stupid kill-stealing killjoys in the last game. Other launch titles included Starship Limburger, Operation Cone Snail, Fardio Brothers 3, Even Stinkier, Slow Mouse, Lawsuit Larry, and Jillian Squalia, Ace Magician. The Beta Shark performed quite well, but it never outperformed the Super Nintendo in sales, or even the Sega Genesis for that matter. The main problem people had was its high price tag, which was over $550 USD in today's money, making it considerably more expensive than the Super Nintendo, which had a much bigger library of games. It also had just one periphery, the Sharkware, a light gun periphery that was notoriously finicky and only compatible with 3 games. In addition, Lawsuit Larry, one of the launch titles, was a pretty bad game with unintuitive controls, hilariously bad dialogue that reads like a bad translation, and a running gag about giraffes that gets old really quickly. In addition, Fardio Brothers 3 and Slow Mouse were subject to lawsuits by Nintendo and Sega respectively, accusing them of copyright infringement. While Sharkware technically came out on top, able to prove that these games fell under fair use as parody games, they still lost a lot of money on their lawyers. And if that wasn't bad enough, Jillian Squalia, Ace Magician, was targeted as being satanic due to its use of magic and making said magic a good thing. Also at the end of that game, Jillian starts dating Francis Sucus at the end of it, which, while unrelated, is extremely cute. Much like its predecessor, the last Beta Shark game was another Sharkman title, Sharkman World Tour. World Tour pushed the Beta Shark to its limits, and made all the characters extremely funny and likable, and kept the basic gameplay of 3 intact, while also allowing you to recruit the final bosses from the other 3 games as playable characters. And they were actually pretty fun and satisfying to play as. World Tour even ditched the top-down perspective for a low-poly 3D action RPG, and it also ended with Francis Sucus marrying Jillian Squalia. It's every bit as adorable as it sounds. While its graphics have aged hilariously poorly, it's still fondly remembered for its gameplay and sense of humor. However, the Beta Shark was put to bed at about the same time as the Super Nintendo was, and then Sharkware began to create what would be their last console. In 1996, only 3 months after the release of the Nintendo 64, the Gamma Shark hit the stores, packaged with Sharkman 5, Finality, a name that's much harsher or more hilarious in hindsight, depending on how you look at it. It's a 3D action RPG, where you find out that Mr. Carchero has a son now, and is wanting to retire from his days of adventuring before a new threat forces his hand. You play the first level as him, only for him to die at the end, causing you instead to play as his son, Gerald Carchero, and his best friend, Antonio Sucus. The game was good, but not good enough to hide the Gamma Shark's fatal flaws. The Gamma Shark was very cheaply made, being $50 cheaper than the Nintendo 64 on launch day, and with cheap materials in a desperate attempt to bring in a new crowd of gamers, which worked at first. However, it soon became apparent that the parts used to make the system were prone to failing. And within a year, almost all original copies were broken beyond repair, some even catching fire. New Gamma Sharks were made with better and more expensive hardware, forcing them to raise the price up to being $20 cheaper than the Nintendo 64, instead of just $50. But the Nintendo 64 was already losing to the more expensive PlayStation. The Gamma Shark also held one notable peripheral, an attachment that allowed it to play floppy disk games, in an era where floppy disks were going out of style. Add to that the fact that some games were way too complicated to be played with a controller, and this was a very poorly conceived idea. Unfortunately, the Gamma Shark was never able to live down the poor quality of the initial release, and a bad wave of games such as Fadio Brothers 4, Pushi's World, Giant's Cup, Madden 2000, and Starship Limburger, Cheese of Glory didn't exactly help matters. The console was discontinued in 2001, and Sharkware filed for bankruptcy. After this, Manning and LaFleur weren't heard from again until 2018, when they worked with Nintendo to release Sharkman Ultimate Collection for the Nintendo Switch, which contains all 5 official Sharkman games, the 2 spin-offs, and a secret, unlockable interview with the two, where they talk about what they might have done if the Gamma Shark hadn't been such a complete disaster. In this interview, they said that they'd have left Gerald Karshiro have his own adventures, potentially in different genres, probably got into the first-person shooter market, and probably called their 4th console the Delta Shark. As for Starship Limburger, they said they'd have wanted it to turn into a Fleet Commander type game or something possibly akin to Mass Effect but much sillier. As for Fadio Bros, they probably would have stopped with those games since Nintendo were always salty about them. They closed the video by taking a dig at how scummy Atari has become, and then they answered the age-old question, why Limburger cheese? Their answer, because it's funny. The interview has one particularly notable quote from Manning. The Alpha Shark succeeded, in our eyes, because it was 70% passion, 30% spite. I think the longer we went on, the more it skewed towards spite and plain old greed. The Gamma Shark failed, I think, because it was 60% greed, 35% spite, and only 5% passion. And that, for now, concludes the history of Sharkware. So, let me tell you guys, this was really fun and interesting to write, and I hope it was fun and interesting to listen to. If not, I apologize. I would also like to apologize for my allergies. Those are never fun to work with. As you can probably tell. So, yeah. There's that thought experiment. In the comments, let me see how you would handle a subject like this, or, if you're feeling extra fun, maybe you could give some fake conspiracy theories as to why Madden 85 failed so hard. I would love to see you guys make that sort of thing. Anyway, thanks, and goodbye.